Hey guys, welcome back to We're Talking Movies. This is Cade, joined by my friend Andrew, and this is our review for Forrest Gump from 1994. Andrew, with Forrest Gump, before we really get into our pros and cons, when it comes to this movie, it's often regarded as one of the greatest films ever made. Is this something that you would agree with?
I definitely agree with you on that one, just because, in my opinion, this probably cracks my top 10 favorite movies of all time. It is just that well made and it's that well directed and acted, and it's just infinitely rewatchable.
Yeah, it definitely is. So when it comes to our pros of this movie, one pro that I've always had is just the overall story that the film has to tell. The movie does such a great job tackling so many different time periods and the crucial events of Forrest's life. We see him as a young kid, we see him as a young man in college, when he plays football, when he enlists in the army, when he starts his shrimp business, and then finally at the end when he becomes a father. Part of what makes the story of this movie so great is that the protagonist, Forrest, doesn't really have any big goals in his life. He just does things, and doing all those different things is part of what helps him grow as a character. And I think that this movie really supports the idea that characters don't just grow or evolve or change because of the things that happen to them. They also change because of the decisions that they make in life, which I think is unique about the film.
That's a really good way of putting it. It reminds me of, I can't remember who described it as this, but somebody described this movie as a look back at some very tumultuous decades in American history through the eyes of a charming simpleton who doesn't really have any major impact on any of those major historical events, but he always seems to be there, here to witness them.
Yeah, and one thing that I think the movie utilizes really, really well is the use of narration. And I know that narration isn't for everybody, but I think that part of what makes it work so well in this movie is because of who Forrest is telling it to. You know, he's not exactly telling it to us, like straight to us or a specific character in the film. He's just telling it to all these random people who he meets on the park bench while he's waiting to catch that bus. I really just love that concept. And I also think that the narration is done very well by Tom Hanks, who obviously has such a classic voice. So that's definitely an aspect of this movie that I think is done perfectly.
That is a very unique way to present a movie. And again, like you said, Tom Hanks has a very charming voice to it, and his southern drawl, I think, kind of adds to his appeal in this movie. But something else, another aspect that I love about how they present this is just the vastly different reactions he gets from the people he's talking to on the bus stop bench. You know, some people are completely indifferent. Others, like the little old lady, is clearly very interested and wants to hear more of his story. And others can't genuinely or don't believe a damn word coming out of his mouth. But again, it kind of there's a lot of charm in this movie, and that's one of the pieces that kind of adds to it, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think another big pro that we both had with this movie is definitely just Tom Hanks and the character of Forrest Gump. I would argue that this is actually the best performance of Tom Hanks's career. Would you agree?
That is a very tough question because this is one of the true elites of Hollywood's leading men history. It's definitely in the conversation. I think you could also maybe say Philadelphia or Saving Private Ryan, or hell, if you really want to go that aspect, even Toy Story. But this is definitely one is definitely in the conversation.
Well, and when it comes to the character of Forrest Gump, I mean, he might not be the smartest guy in the room, but he definitely has a heart of gold and he always does what he thinks is right. And that's part of what makes him such a likable character. That and Tom Hanks's charming performance, that's a part of what makes Forrest just fun to follow. I think a big part of this is just because of how innocent Forrest is as a character. And I think Tom does such an incredible job capturing that with his performance.
Yeah, and the other aspect is that Forrest always seems to improve the lives of those around him, even those that don't exactly want him to improve those around him. Looking squarely at Lieutenant Dan on that one, but yeah, he just always seems to leave a mark wherever he goes, and I think that's kind of what makes him such a lovable protagonist is that he's never really ever out for himself. He seems to always kind of want to be helping those around him. And he spends a couple of decades chasing love, and that's the backdrop of this entire movie. He just also happens to get involved or witness some of the biggest events of the mid 20th century.
Yeah, and also one scene in the movie that I did want to acknowledge that I found really comforting when we learn it about Forrest is there's that scene where he meets his son when he reunites with Jenny, and he asks Jenny, is he smart or is he like, and he pauses, he doesn't have time to say, is he like me? What I like about that is, apart from Tom's performance, which is obviously great, I also like learning that Forrest knows about himself. I like learning that about him because throughout most of the movie, and this is just my experience, but it seems like Forrest isn't fully aware about his intelligence. But in this scene, you find out that he does know. And I don't know, I just find something really comforting about that scene.
Yeah, and I agree. It's not something that I immediately thought of when I wanted to talk about this movie, but that's a really good point.
But aside from Tom and the character of Forrest, there's also some of the other characters and performances in the movie. We have Robin Wright, who does an incredible job as Jenny. The two of them, I think, had such great chemistry together. And I think that what's nice about the movie is, yeah, it's mainly about the life of Forrest, but Jenny's also such a huge part of that movie. And it's also part of it is about the tragic life that she lives and the sort of self destructive path that she sets out on over the course of the film. I also like how despite the fact that they're two different people, the bond between them just feels so strong.
It really is. It's kind of like that's why I can describe it is they sort of explore different aspects of the same time period they were both living in this story. You know, you got Forrest who went to Vietnam and had to deal with all the fallout of being a veteran from that time period, whereas Jenny was a part of the more the counterculture her aspect, kind of like the hippie movement. So you get to see both sides of the conflict and of that time period, and you actually see that a lot with a lot of the other characters of the movie. Bubba and Lieutenant Dan come to mind in my opinion too, because Bubba, great character, very well acted, kind of does a really good job at kind of showcasing, you know, what it was like for African Americans in this country in the time immediately after the civil rights movement. Lieutenant Dan and kind of showed the hardships and ridicule and vitriol that Vietnam vets had to go through when they were coming back. Again, there's just a lot of really memorable, enjoyable characters in this movie. And then when people do die in this movie, you do care about them and you do feel very sad. You know, there are tears are shed when you watch this movie, even though it is a very charming movie. It can also be very sad on occasion too.
Yeah, and speaking of that, when you have characters like Bubba and Jenny and even Mrs. Gump, when they pass away, you do feel sad because they are memorable characters. And another standout character for me in this movie, just because you're just talking about him, was definitely Lieutenant Dan. One of the things that I really liked about his character was his loyalty. You know, even though he had a lot of bitterness toward Forrest after he saved him against his will and lost his legs, Lieutenant Dan did stay true to that promise that he made to Forrest that he would be his first mate on that troop boat. And as the film progresses, he does learn to forgive Forrest, and the two eventually form their business and they become wealthy together. That is something that I did really like about Lieutenant Dan. You know, I just really liked how loyal he was to Forrest despite their not perfect relationship. And I would argue that aside from Bubba and maybe even Jenny, he might be the closest thing that Forrest has to a best friend.
Yes, and this is kind of like I was talking about a few minutes ago. Forrest does improve the lives of everybody he comes across, even if they don't want it, because at the beginning when they first meet, let's face it, Lieutenant Dan and Forrest are quite literally the exact opposite in personality. You know, simpleton who's kind of always, you know, just happy to be doing what he's told, and then the, you know, very gruff and rough around the edges, you know, calloused Vietnam soldier. But again, like you said, no, they do eventually kind of form this bond over the course of the movie. You know, again, I don't think Lieutenant Dan exactly wanted it in the first place, but I think he kind of realizes at point like, okay, I'm never going to get rid of this guy, and I did make him a promise. So
But what about you? Are there any other pros that you have with the movie?
I need to talk about my second biggest pro behind just Forrest Gump as a character, and that is the soundtrack for this movie. Bold statement. This is the best soundtrack in film history
Really? What makes you say that?
because this soundtrack features literally any kind of music you could think of. You got rockabilly, you got blues, you got soul, you got Motown, you got R&B, you got rock and roll from the 60s and the 70s, you got country even, and it all perfectly fits because of what this movie is about. You know, you're traveling, you know, you're following Forrest through all these different time periods, so it would make sense that he's going to all hear all these different styles of music and all these progressions of music. Plus the fact, you know, this movie is kind of, in my opinion, responsible for the old stereotype of let's all go to the Nam, cue All Along the Watchtower by Jimi Hendrix, or For What It's Worth by Buffalo Springfield. It's a really, really good soundtrack, and I really, really like it. Again, it's probably my second, maybe third favorite part of the movie behind Forrest as a main character, and also just all the supporting characters and how they interact and how Forrest kind of comes in and out of their lives at different points. And
Yeah, yeah, I get what you mean. But why don't we move on to the few cons that we have with this movie? Do you want to start?
yeah, mine's gonna be pretty damn short. I don't have any. This is the first movie we've ever reviewed that I genuinely couldn't come up with anything I really didn't like. I'm sure if I really, really wanted to nitpick, I could come up with a couple of things, but I really like this movie. I have for a very long time. I don't really have anything really bad to say about it. Do you have anything you want to say about it?
I don't think so. I don't have any really big issues with the movie. I think it's just so incredibly well made. It's got a great story to tell. Yeah, I don't really have any big issues with it. If I had any issue with it, maybe, and this is going to sound stupid, but for me, the whole ping pong section of the movie is one of the least interesting aspects of the movie. It's not that it's poorly executed or anything. It's just personally, I didn't find it as fun or interesting to follow. especially when compared to him running across America or his time in Vietnam or when he was on a shipping boat. To me, just the whole ping pong aspect, I get that it was essential, but it just didn't feel as interesting for me compared to all the other events in his life.
All right, I can definitely see where you're coming from. I definitely think it was important, but now that you put it like that, I might agree with you on that one. I think it's maybe the least interesting of the various phases of Forrest life we see.
Yeah, but on a scale of 1 to 10, what would you give this movie?
Well, considering the fact I literally had nothing bad to say about it, feel like this kind of is inevitable. I might give this a 10. I really do really like this movie, and I have for a very long time. In fact, I actually have the remastered Blu-ray version on DVD.
Yep, me too. I think for me, on a scale of 1 to 10, I don't know if I'll give it a 10. I think I might give it a 9.5. I think it's that great of a movie. And yeah, I think it is one of the best movies ever made.
Yeah. Also, this is kind of a bit of an occasion. I do believe this is the first movie we reviewed that's won Best Picture.
I believe so. Yeah,
Also, it's one of the first. I believe it's also the first movie we reviewed from the one of the greatest years in film history. That was 1994, if I'm not mistaken.
that is correct. All right, guys, I think that's the end of this review. Thanks so much for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you later.